As two mysterious strangers enter the gate, the ruler declares that nothing enters this city that I do not own. When the strangers refuse to bow, the ruler signals the mob, turning the city's decadence into a predatory hunt. We feel the visceral tension of an angry mob hammering at Lot's door, their shadows stretching across his terrified daughters. In the height of the panic, a translucent, glowing hand seized Lot's arm. It is a divine sentence masquerading as a rescue, a reminder that his survival is no longer in his own hands. The sun had barely dipped below the horizon when the first stone struck the heavy cedar door. Outside, the golden city had transformed into a predatory beast, its collective breath a low, rhythmic growl of order and possession. Lot felt the vibration of the mob's hatred through the wood, his hands trembling as he barred the entrance. "They don't run, they hide," he whispered, shielded only by the flickering lamp and the presence of the two silent guests. Suddenly, the door groaned under a massive surge. As the mob prepared to breach the sanctuary, the strangers stepped forward, their eyes igniting with a cold, celestial light. With a single sweeping gesture, the world outside went silent. A sudden darkness that can be felt fell upon the attackers, leaving them clutching at empty air, blinded by a power they could not understand. Inside the sudden ringing silence of the house, the air grew heavy with the scent of ozone and ancient dust. The strangers turned to Lot, their faces no longer human masks, but radiant with a terrifying, impartial light. "This is no longer a warning," the taller one spoke, his voice sounding like the grinding of tectonic plates. "The outcry against this place has reached the throne. The divine fire is already descending." He pointed toward the horizon, where the bruised sky began to pulse with a jagged, rhythmic heat. "By dawn, Sodom will be a memory of ash." The sentence was final, a cosmic decree that left no room for negotiation or prayer. Lot hurried through the humid, narrow alleys to the villas of his sons-in-law, his breath coming in ragged gasps. Inside, the air was thick with the scent of spiced wine and the sound of careless music. When he spoke of the falling fire and the city's end, his words were met not with fear, but with a wall of cruel, rising laughter. To them, the prosperous walls of Sodom were eternal, and Lot was merely a man broken by dreams of dust. They toasted to the city's strength, mocking his madness as he pleaded for their lives. As the first gray light of dawn touched the towers, Lot realized they were already ghosts, tethered to a world that was being weighed and found wanting. In the flickering glow of the impending storm, Lot and his wife stood paralyzed in the center of their courtyard, their shadows stretching to the life they were about to lose. Every stone and woven tapestry held a ghost of a memory, decades of status and comfort now reduced to the weight of the past. His wife's gaze lingered on the silver ornaments and the hearth where their daughters had played, her heart anchored to a world the messengers had already judged. It was an agonizing internal struggle, a silent war between the safety of the known and the terrifying void of the desert. As the floorboards groaned under the weight of their hesitation, the first scent of sulfur drifted through the halls, signaling that the time for mourning had ended. The first sliver of dawn cut through the sulphurous haze like a blade, but Lot remained anchored to the threshold of his life, his heart fracturing at the thought of the void beyond the gates. The air began to hum with a low subterranean frequency, and the limestone floors beneath his feet trembled with the first tremors of a world coming undone. Sensing his fatal hesitation, the messengers no longer waited for his resolve. With the strength that felt like the pull of a tide, the glowing angelic hands seized Lot, his wife, and his daughters. They were physically dragged from the sanctuary of their home, their feet barely touching the cobblestones as the city's foundations began to groan under the weight of the coming fire.
As they cleared the city's outer shadow, the bruised sky finally fractured, and the first divine fire descended not as rain, but as a torrential downpour of liquid gold and burning brimstone. The atmosphere ignited with a visceral roar, turning the air into a furnace of 4K cinematic spectacle as the grand temples of the Golden City were struck by arcing white bolts of celestial fury. Stone columns that had stood for centuries shattered like glass, their intricate carvings melting into rivers of fire as the very foundations of Sodom's hubris began to liquefy. It was a sky of blood and ozone, a catastrophic erasure that turned the high towers into pillars of flame against the dark, suffocating horizon. The heat became a physical weight, pressing against their backs as they fled across the cracked earth of the Jordan Valley. Behind them, the Golden City was no longer a place of stone and commerce, but a roaring furnace that consumed the horizon. Lot stumbled through the blinding haze, his breath searing his lungs, as the celestial fire turned the atmosphere into a thundering wake of destruction. "Run for your lives!" the command echoed in his mind, a rhythmic pulse that drowned out the distant, muffled screams of a dying civilization. They were shadows racing against an apocalypse, small and fragile, while the world they once loved dissolved into a sea of molten gold and white-hot fury. The earth screamed as the plain behind them dissolved into a sea of white-hot sulfur, but the command to never look back felt heavier than the fire itself. Lot's wife stumbled, her heart tethered to the city by 1,000 invisible threads, the life she had built, the home she had loved, and the sons she had left to the flames. In one fatal moment of looking back, her resolve fractured. As she turned her eyes toward the roaring furnace of Sodom, the celestial heat didn't consume her, it preserved her. The tragedy was instantaneous. A flash of crystalline light turned her warm breath into stone, leaving her standing as a silent, frozen pillar of salt, a permanent monument to a heart that could not let go. The sun crested the jagged peaks of Zoar, but its light brought no warmth to the hollow remains of the Jordan Valley. Standing on the desolate mountain, Lot watched as the divine fire completed its silent, absolute work. Below, the once glimmering golden city had vanished beneath a thick, suffocating shroud of black soot that rose like the smoke of a furnace. There was no sound of life, only the crackle of a world turned to ash. Clutching his daughters, Lot stood as a stranger in a new land, his gaze fixed on the horizon where his past had been erased. It was a new, lonely beginning, a survival bought at a price that would haunt the silence of the wilderness forever.